So just some reminders and tips moving forward. The public speaking context is different than the interpersonal speaking context. So an interpersonal speaking context is something like sitting down at dinner with your family or talking on the phone with a friend or working with a small group of classmates in a breakout group. It's a situation in which there is dialogue. There's more than one person talking, you're sharing ideas, etc. The public speaking context includes usually a speaker and an audience. And because of that, there are different constraints. So, usually in a public speaking context, you will need to stand. You will need to project your voice in order to reach an audience. And you're going to deliver your message in a more polished and formal way than you might talk to a group of classmates in a breakout group. And so I know that in this online format of our class, things feel, I mean, you don't have an audience, right? And that's tough. And we're really missing out on that in this class, and it's unfortunate. But the way to build up these skills for your real life situations later on, we really need to practice those skills anyways. And so we're just going to fake it until we make it. And so when you are delivering your speech, please have in mind that you should be presenting your speech as though you're talking to an audience. So project your voice like you're talking to an audience, be polished, be formal enough, doesn't have to be too formal, but you shouldn't be like seated in your hallway, leaned over your laptop and whispering into the microphone because you don't want to wake up the person in the next room, right? So keep that in mind when you're thinking about when you're going to record your speech too, that you're not recording at 2 a.m. if it's going to bother everyone in your house. Okay. The next tip here is use a variety of sources. So you have all demonstrated that you are capable of doing research and finding credible sources, and that's great. To take it to the next level, I want to recommend using a variety of sources in your speech. So that means not just finding an expert quote to back up each point and not just dumping in 15 statistics back to back to back to back, because having all one type of source makes it harder for the audience to remember each of those as a distinct thing. And especially when it comes to statistics, if you have a lot of statistics, it is incredibly difficult for the audience to really integrate that and to understand what all of those statistics mean. So as you are deploying your sources in your speech, try to use them wisely and use them in such a way that it's going to make a real difference in your speech and it's going to enhance the impact of your speech. The next tip is to use all the organizational tools. And so when we talk about organization in a speech, there's a lot to think about. You have the basic three-part structure of the speech where you have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And each of those parts needs, a good amount of attention. So when we think about the introduction of a speech, you do not want to start your speech by saying, "Hi, my name's Eileen, and today I'm going to talk about public speaking." You want to start with a real attention grabber or a hook. And then you need to provide an inroad into your topic. You should include an organizational preview to help your audience follow along, etc. So do really think about all the components of the speech. The body of the speech isn't the only part you have to deliver. We want it to be a real full experience from beginning to end. Also think about how you can let an organizational pattern do some work for you. A lot of speeches in the informative speech unit, we're using the topical pattern. What that means is that each point in the speech related back to the thesis, but didn't relate to the other points in the speech necessarily. The other organizational pattern options set up a structure wherein each of the points relates back to the thesis, but also relates to the other points somehow. And the nice thing about that is that when the main points of your speech relate to each other, it makes it simpler for you to create effective transition statements. So you don't just have to say, "and now my next point is," but that you can actually link the last thing you said to the next thing that you're going to say in a sensible way. So think about letting the organizational pattern do some of the work for you, because if you know that you are using a cause and effect or a problem solution or a chronological pattern, the pattern itself sort of tells you what information or what content goes where in the speech as well. And so it takes a lot of the burden off of you in the invention or creation phase of the speech. Okay, this next point, the audience can't go back to re-listen. I know that in the online format, when we're uploading videos, we can go back and re-listen. But again, as we are practicing skills for the after times, try and keep in mind that your audience in a real life setting isn't reading along with you. They haven't seen your outline in advance, so they don't know what your main points are going to be. And they can't go back and re-listen to something if they don't catch it the first time. And so reasons why an audience might not catch something the first time could include they weren't expecting it because it didn't fit into the organization, or there was no preview, or there was no transition to let them know something important was coming. Or you spoke too fast and you whizzed by it and they didn't catch it, or they just moved on to the next thing and didn't realize it was something they needed to catch. Or there was no break in the speech, like no pauses to give them a moment to digest things. So think about all of those options as ways of helping your audience to remember what you said. So, having all those organizational tools in place is one part of it. Having a speaking pace that is intelligible is another part of that, but also adding intentional pauses at your transitional moments, and also at any important like statistic or quote that you really want your audience to think about before moving on in your speech. This next point I touched on in the last slide, we are doing extemporaneous speech in this class, and that means that you are researched and prepared and rehearsed, and you can mostly deliver your speech from memory. And that doesn't mean word for word, right? But you know what's coming and you know what you want to say, and that you have note cards available that might have keywords of your outline on there in case you lose your spot. And it might have like important statistics and quotes that you need to read verbatim, or whatever kind of cues you need, like cue cards to keep you going, but that you are not reading from a script, and you're not using the nice availability of having a laptop screen in front of you to read from, because you won't have that necessarily in a real life situation. So please do, if you need to speak with some notes, practice writing them onto note cards and presenting with them. It's okay if you have to look at your cards sometimes, as long as you're not holding them up here and reading from them. But this is an important skill, and it really will serve you at some point in the future. And this last point is related to the public speaking context. Please do please do stand unless you are not able to do so. And by not able to do so, I mean, if you have a disability or an injury that prevents you from being able to stand, then you can sit, that's fine. And also coming up in the persuasive speech, if you are choosing to use Zoom screen sharing like I'm doing right now for your visual aid, you will probably need to sit, because if you're standing far back enough, you won't be able to necessarily control your screen. Unless you can. If you want to hold your mouse way back there, or you have a clicker or something, go for it. But I understand that there are reasons why not everyone will be able to stand when they deliver their speech, and that's fine. I'm not going to ask you for an excuse note, and I'm not going to mark you off, but I really do strongly encourage you to stand, because this is how you're going to learn to control your body movements, to use your space well, to work through that feeling of adrenaline that you might get by standing up and delivering a speech. So please do take advantage of this time in this classroom and use it like a laboratory to experiment with what's really going to work for you in real life speaking situations. Okay. So let's talk about persuasive speeches. A good persuasive speech will develop an argument. It's going to use an effective organizational pattern, and it's going to use all three proofs of persuasion. And we're going to talk about that in this lecture. So to recap, because the first stage in the persuasive speech making process is picking a topic again, let's remember that a good topic is interesting to both you and your audience, It is controversial, which means that there's more than one reasonable side to the issue, but not so controversial that you'll never be able to change people's opinions. It is researchable. It's not just based on your personal experience and opinions. You have to be able to go out there and find credible research to support your position. And it is able to be framed in a way that the audience can both hear and take some action. So for example, you don't want to give a speech about climate change and tell us how everything is awful and we're destroying the planet and we're all going to die. And then leave us feeling like there's nothing we can do about it and we're just real depressed. Maybe all those things are true, but you can frame your speech in a way that makes it actionable by your audience, and that equips us with a feeling of agency, and that's going to motivate your audience to do something about it. So this is a recap again. In your persuasive speech, you are very likely to be making a claim of policy or value. It is totally possible that you're still making a claim of fact, but then it would be a controversial fact, something that people debate. So as a recap, claims of fact are claims that state that something is or is not true. And so in a persuasive speech, if you're making a claim of fact, it's something that people debate whether it's true or not. And it's something that reasonable people with, evidence on both sides will debate. Trying to argue that climate change isn't real or isn't happening, that's not a debatable fact. It's just widely accepted by the entire scientific community that climate change is real. So, if you want to argue a claim of fact, do make sure that it's credible, that there are credible arguments on both sides, because there are plenty of things that are still debated in our public discourse and in our media that aren't actually controversial in a credible, resourced way. So if you're not sure about your topic, just hit me up and I can let you know, like, hey, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence over here that says this. Claims of value are judgments about what's good or bad, right or wrong, things that we should value more or less. So, for example, if you wanted to argue that music education should be part of the core curriculum and should not be considered an extra add-on, right? If you argued that music education is just as important to children's development as math and reading education, you're arguing that this thing is important, that it's good, that we should value it more. And then claims of policy provide solutions to problems, and they tell us what course of action we should or should not take. And this can be at the individual level, like we should all meditate 5 minutes a day. That's a claim of policy because it's telling us what to do. Or they can be sort of broader, larger sort of claims to what we as a larger group of people should do, whether that means what we as citizens should do, what we as human beings should do, etc. So, if your argument is that we should ban fracking, that's not something that you and I are going to do individually, but it is a path that we should take. It's a solution to a problem. It's, it's a thing that should be done. So that's a claim of policy. Okay, so as a recap, we've already talked about a number of organizational patterns in the informative speaking unit. And there are two more that I want to introduce that are particularly useful for certain types of persuasive speeches. The comparative advantages organizational pattern compares two things side by side and shows why one of them is more advantageous than the other, or why we should value something, why we should value something equally or more as. If you remember, one of your classmates made a speech about why we should consider professional fishing to be just as highly regarded as professional basketball or baseball playing. And so that speech used a comparative advantages. It, took three criterion about the athlete, about the amount of training that they have to do, and about the endorsements that they have and how they're all shown on the same TV stations, and compared them sort of apples to apples. And so this is really good to use for a value claim, but can also be used to advocate for policies, anything that you sort of want to compare to show one to be better than the other or show things to be equal. So here's a sample basic speech outline. for comparative advantages organizational pattern. If my specific purpose was to persuade my audience that Nook is better than Kindle, I can go about that a number of different ways. I can make a value claim and say Nook is better than Kindle, or I could make a policy claim and say you should buy a Nook. Either way I go with my thesis, I can still use the comparative advantages pattern to prove that. So then my main points might be, the first one is about loaning books. The second one is about the color screen. And the third one is about expanding memory. And so on each of those 3 points or criteria, I'm going to compare the Nook to the Kindle. The next organizational pattern that I want to share is called Monroe's motivated sequence. This is very common in marketing, in advertising, when someone's trying to get you to buy something. And so it's often considered to be one of the best patterns to use if you're appealing for your audience to take personal action. You really want them to get up and go do something at the end of your speech. So the pattern has 5 parts. The first part is attention, and that can happen in the introduction of the speech. And then there's a need, where we talk about what is sort of the problem that we need to address, and that would be in the body of the speech as main point 1. Then there is satisfaction, which is the second main point, so that's the solution to the problem. And then visualization is the third main point in the body, and that is getting your audience to imagine like how much better their life will be after they do this. And you do that through really great narration and description, and you're trying to get your audience to really visualize something. And then in the conclusion of the speech, you have your call to action. And I will post a video of an example of this pattern in our general discussion forum. Okay, so we've talked about some speech basics and we have talked about organizational patterns. Now I'm going to talk about Aristotle's 3 proofs of persuasion. So Aristotle is sort of the grandfather of the discipline of rhetoric within which we study public speaking. And Aristotle said that we have means available to us to create persuasion just based on the creativity of our mind. And he called these artistic proofs because they're things that we create ourselves just out of thin air. As opposed to inartistic proofs, which might include like evidence or expert testimony, like things that are already existing in the world. So what Aristotle is focused on is, what are all of the available means of persuasion that we have, and how can we deploy all of them effectively? And so he categorizes these proofs into 3: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is an appeal to, it's not really a direct appeal. So ethos is the audience's perception of the speaker's credibility. This is not going to be a direct appeal. And by that, I mean, in order to come across as a credible speaker, you are not necessarily going to explain to your audience what makes you credible on this topic. It's great to mention that you've done research. It's great to mention that you have some personal connection to a topic, and so on and so forth. But the point of ethos is whether or not the audience perceives you to be credible, which has to do with a lot more than you just stating your credentials at the beginning of the speech. Pathos is an appeal to the audience's emotion. So what can you do to get the audience to feel a certain way about something? And logos is anything that is related to the reasoning and evidence in your speech. And a good persuasive speech is going to take all of these into account and employ all 3 proofs. So let's talk a little bit about ethos. Aristotle says that there are sort of 3 contributing factors that make an audience trust a speaker. The first one is if the speaker embodies phronesis, or common sense. The second one is if the speaker seems to embody arete, which is virtue. For Aristotle, it was about civic virtue, like, are you doing your own part? And then the third one is about whether the speaker seems to embody eunoia, or goodwill toward the audience. So does the speaker seem to have the audience's best interests at heart? So how can we sort of employ these concepts in a speech? Well, you can get the audience to trust you by how you interact with them. If you seem like you've got some skin in the game and you're being respectful, you're using inclusive language and so on. If you project an ethical demeanor, if you seem pragmatic or oriented toward an achievable goal, that's that common sense aspect, right? The phronesis. If you seem knowledgeable, your audience is going to trust you more. That comes by using oral citations. And if you seem to have control of the speaking situation by the way that you deliver your speech, you're going to seem credible. So if you're getting sort of out of control, or you compound your delivery mistakes, then you're going to seem less credible as a speaker. So you want to control the audience's perception of your motivation for addressing the topic. And that means actually saying why you care about a topic. If you don't seem like you have skin in the game, you might come across as manipulative or as uncaring. You can use concise and well-organized phrases to help demonstrate your competence. So this comes down to really rehearsing and thinking about how you want to say things. You want to avoid compounding mistakes in delivery. Everybody makes mistakes in delivery, whether that's using vocal fillers like and or it's forgetting what you're going to say, or it's stumbling over a word. You know, we all do these things. But if you compound those mistakes by stopping and saying, oh my gosh, I have to regroup, I'm sorry, you're going to seem less credible. It's kind of unfair because, you know, it takes a lot of practice to get comfortable with that kind of thing. But the more comfortable you are with it and the more you can roll with the punches, the more credible you're going to seem as a speaker. You can create identifications. So that's personalizing your speech. You can help, you can talk about the personal effects of the issue and connect them to the audience. So help them see how what you're talking about affects them or is related to their lives and their interests. And you can think about how you take up space in a room. You know, use your stage to your advantage. You can move in your space. Use your physical presence. Use a tone of voice that is authoritative, and so on. And so when you take up your space authoritatively, your audience is going to be more likely to see you as credible. Okay. Pathos is the appeal to emotion. So you want to think about what emotions you want to develop in your audience that will help you in persuasion. So if you are selling a car, we might think about buying and selling a car as not really like an emotional activity. But if I really want to sell you something and I want you to give me a lot of money, I might try to make you feel really good about that purchase, right? I want you to feel like you want to give me that money. And so the way I'm going to do that is to play on your desire to be fancy, or your desire to have freedom, or to feel adventurous, or to feel safe, and figure out like what emotions can I try and get you to feel in order to dispose you favorably towards my claim. So you can start by thinking about how does your audience already feel about a topic? There might already be feelings there. You can think about how they're likely to react to your arguments. And then you can try and think about how you can get the audience to feel something that's going to help you. A lot of the way that you get someone to feel something is through implicit connections. And that means not telling someone like, this is scary, you should be scared, but by telling a story that's like pretty bleak, that we can sort of make the connection like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're headed in this terrible direction, right? I can connect those dots for myself. But when it comes to those negative emotional connections, just be careful, because when you are trying to get your audience to feel fear, anxiety, or threatened, it can lead you into unethical territory. And that's all I'm going to say about that, is just to be careful and aware of when you're trying to play on negative emotions. And they can be incredibly powerful and they can be really useful, but just be careful. And if this is a type of appeal that you want to use in your speech and you're not sure about it, you can always hit me up and I'm happy to help. So pathos is not just about what you include in your speech, but also how you deliver it. So if you're trying to deliver a really emotional story and you're not making eye contact, you're not looking at the camera, it's not going to land as well. You can also use your voice to help add to the sort of drama of your speech that encourages people to feel a certain way. And you yourself can show emotion in your speech if you think it's going to help. So pathos is all about what is the audience feeling, but you can show emotion in your speech as well, and that might encourage your audience to sort of feel a certain way. So if you want your audience to feel sympathetic and you talk about something sad that happened to you and you look sad, then your audience might feel sympathetic about it, right? But keep yourself under control. We don't want to be like Phil Davidson, who was our first speech example of the semester. So do be aware of the emotions that you are presenting as well during your speech. And everyone did a good job of that in the first speech, so I'm not too worried about it. Okay, logos is all about argument and reasoning. And so what is an argument? What do you need to have a complete argument? Well, the simplest definition of an argument is that you have a claim with some sort of support. A claim is whatever it is that you're trying to establish. That's your end point. That's what you want people to get on board with. Support backs up your claim in some way. It's whatever you're basing your argument off of. And then the implication or your reasoning or your explanation is what connects those two things together. So you might see some different terminology in our textbook, in the way that I talk about argument. And if you take any future argument or rhetoric classes, you might hear this a little bit differently, but they're all sort of saying the same thing. An argument has to have a claim. It also needs some sort of grounds or support, like something that you're basing it off of, data, right? And then you have to have something that connects those two things together. And often that reasoning or inference or warrant, that thing that connects them together, is implied. And I'll show some examples of that. So you can think about an argument as having a kind of structure. This structure that I'm going to show you is developed by Stephen Toulmin, who is a Canadian legal scholar who analyzed a bunch of legal arguments to see what is the actual way that humans argue. This is different than like the Aristotle's model of deduction that's, highly theoretical and talks about an ideal model, whatever. We don't need ideal models. We want real life. We want to learn from people who make good arguments in real life. And so Toulmin came along and said that, arguments can be very complicated, and what makes an argument acceptable or not, or valid or not, totally depends on the field in which you're making that argument. So, we might be able to make an argument seem really compelling among a general audience of people who don't know a lot about a topic. But that same argument might not be as compelling among an audience of experts who already knows a lot. So thinking about how our evidence functions in an argument has a lot to do with knowing who our audience is. So here's the sort of basic structure of the argument that Toulmin came up with. He says that you have your data that you start out with, you're trying to jump to a claim or what you're trying to get people to agree to, and then your warrant is what sort of connects those two things together. So here's an example argument to show you what those three parts look like. And this is an example from Toulmin's book, The Uses of Argument. I am a British citizen. I was born in Bermuda. A man born in Bermuda will legally be a British citizen. So which of those three sentences do you think is the claim? What is the thing I'm trying to get you to agree to or to believe? What do you need to believe out of that? It's hard, right? Because all three of these sentences are just statements of fact. So nothing is jumping out at you as being controversial necessarily, right? Well, here it is labeled. The claim, the thing that I need you to believe, is that I am a British citizen. The data that I have, or just like the facts and evidence that I can base that on, is that I was born in Bermuda. But you can see how if you didn't already know this, that might not be enough. Maybe for me, being a British citizen, being born in Bermuda, that is perfectly obvious to me. But if I try to make that argument to someone with just a claim and data, it might not work because they might not know this warrant, this reasoning in between that I have to add in to make it make sense, which is that a man born in Bermuda will legally be a British citizen. That's true. It's British territory. So there are more parts to the argument. I will show you some examples of all of this. I'm not going to go into heavy detail, but I think that it's useful just to see how you can thicken an argument and add more layers to it. So we have our original model here in black text, and then we're adding in the red text. This is the second triad or second three parts of the argument. So we still have the data, claim, and warrant. So if we need additional support for our warrant, we can add backing. If we want to show the strength with which we hold our claim to be true, like how sure are you, you can add a qualifier. And a qualifier is usually just going to be one word or a couple of words, like definitely, maybe, possibly. Those are all qualifiers. They tell us how much we believe that claim to be true. And the rebuttal is any instance in which that claim is not true. This is a tricky one because everyone thinks of the rebuttal as a counter argument, but it's not. It's the exception to the argument holding. So here we're adding all the parts. I'm a British citizen. I was born in Bermuda. A man in Bermuda will legally be a British citizen unless he has betrayed Britain and has become a spy of another country. So that last sentence that we added on is the rebuttal. That is the case in which the claim does not hold true. If you are a traitor, you're no longer British, and you are you give that up. If we wanted to add backing, remember backing is support for the warrant. And the warrant in this case is that a man born in Bermuda will legally be a British citizen. Well, if you didn't believe that, like if I just said that as my warrant and you were like, since when? I might add, well, ever since this year when X, Y, and Z happened and such British legislation passed, that would be backing because it would be supporting the warrant. And then a qualifier could be a word or a phrase that tells me how much I believe the claim to be true. So remember in this case, the claim is I am a British citizen. If I wanted to add a qualifier, I might just say I am absolutely a British citizen. And that word absolutely would be my qualifier. There we go. Okay. So I have one or two more examples of this. I'll read through them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. You can pause and go back if you want to. So let's see this argument. Henrietta has doubled the number of books she owns in the last year. The more books that Henrietta buys, the more storage space she will need, especially because she buys a lot of very large art books. Henrietta should probably buy another bookshelf. Of course, she has some bookshelf space, but she will use that space before the spring semester. Okay, that was a very full argument. There is a claim in here. What's the claim that we're trying to advance? In this case, it's a little bit easier to identify because it's a claim of policy, so it's telling us what we need to do. That claim down here is that Henrietta should buy another bookshelf. So you can see all of the parts are labeled here. The information that we have to start with is how many books she has, and therefore she needs a bookcase. That's a claim. The warrant for that, the thing that connects together how many books she has in bookshelf space is this thing that says, well, if you have more books, you need more bookshelf space, right? And then there's extra backing for that warrant because saying not only does she have a lot of books, they're big, they're physically big. And then we have the case in which it doesn't hold, which is that, well, she already has enough bookshelf space, but then there is a little bit of a counter argument there at the end. Okay, here's another one. Each year, industry pumps millions of carbon dioxide particles into the atmosphere. Empirical evidence from polar ice cores indicates that higher carbon dioxide emissions are associated with global warming. Unless the computer models predicting global warming are incorrect, we must recognize that global warming is a serious problem facing our world. So, what's the claim? What am I trying to get you to accept? Here we go. Let's see. The claim is that we must recognize that global warming is a serious problem facing our world. There's also a qualifier here. It's either we must recognize or that it's a serious problem. There's sort of two qualifiers in there. The data, the evidence that already exists in the world that we're pointing to is that industry is polluting the atmosphere. That's our data. Then we have a warrant and backing. So the warrant is that higher carbon dioxide is associated with global warming. You see how that connects together, the claim and the data? The claim is that global warming is a problem. The data is there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, if you don't know what the relationship is between carbon dioxide and global warming, here we'll tell you higher carbon dioxide means global warming. And then if you don't believe that, let's add backing to that warrant by saying, well, we have empirical evidence from polar ice cores that tell us that this warrant is true, right? And then the rebuttal, the case in which that doesn't hold, is if the computer models are wrong, then all of this goes out the window. Not all warrants are going to be explicitly stated. And in fact, if you have a reasonable expectation that your audience can fill that in for themselves, leaving it out can actually be more persuasive, because then the audience is going to finish the argument for you in their own mind, and we are our own best persuaders. If the audience is unlikely to understand the connections, then you need to make your warrant explicit. So let's look here. Anne's doctor should prescribe penicillin for her. Her test results show that she has a staph infection. So we have a claim. Doctors should prescribe penicillin. That's a claim of policy, something that we should do. And then we have data, her test results. Well, if you didn't already know that penicillin was the prescribed course for a staph infection, this might not make a lot of sense to you. So we would need to add a warrant that says, you know, decades of research shows that penicillin is the best treatment for a staph infection. Okay. Here's one that many of you might not know. John wears a VFW button on his, that's supposed to say lapel. The lapel is the little like edge of a jacket. Therefore, he must have served at one time in the armed forces overseas. Okay, let's think about that again. John wears a VFW button on his lapel. He must have served at one point in the armed forces overseas. Why does that make sense? Why does it make sense that if you see someone wearing a pin or a button that said VFW, you would know that they served overseas? If you don't already know why, this argument wouldn't make sense to you. And so you would need to add an explicit warrant. VFW is the Association for Veterans of Foreign Wars. And that's how you know that. Okay, one more. The state flag is flying over the Capitol today. That is evidence. It's data. It exists in the world and we can point to it. The legislature must be in session. That's a claim of fact. Oh, the legislature is in session. Well, let's just say you're driving sort of by the capital city and you see a flag flying over the Capitol building, and then the person in the car next to you says, oh, the legislature must be in session. I know I would be like, how do you know that? I would just see a flag and think like, oh, Capitol building flag makes sense, right? It's the appropriate decoration for that building. But if that means something, that, you know, flying the flag means the legislature is in session, that might need to be said out loud. And that is about making a warrant explicit for an audience who doesn't already know the connection between the data and the claim. Okay, so you are likely also to have counter arguments to your claim. And that's because you're choosing a topic that has more than one reasonable side. So of course, there's another side. It can be helpful to pick out and refute a common objection to your argument, because it shows that you know there's more than one side to this argument. You are informed and you're not trying to mislead your audience into thinking that you have the only correct side. And if you want to do that, you should frame the argument in favorable terms, unpack its logic, and make your rebuttal, and keep it short. So it's okay to quickly address, it's good to quickly address a counter argument in your speech, but you don't want to devote a ton of time in your speech to arguing against a counter argument. Okay, presentation aids. So I'm going to, okay. So you have the choice to use either an electronic or a non-electronic presentation aid. A non-electronic presentation aid could include a handout in a real speech situation. And if you have a handout for your audience, it's good to give it at the end, because if you pass out a flyer and then you start speaking, your audience is going to read the flyer and not listen to you. You can also use a poster or an object. And the key to a presentation aid, a non-electronic presentation aid, is that your audience has to be able to actually see and read it. So if I wanted to use this brochure as a presentation aid and I was giving a speech about Vizcaya, which is a historic museum and gardens here in Miami, where I am at the moment, I might want to show you this brochure and show you some of the pictures in the brochure, right? The problem with this is that, can you see what's on this brochure? I mean, A, there's lighting that's reflecting on it, but also it's so small in the screen, right? I'm a tiny square in the corner. My presentation aid is so small, you can't read what it says. If your audience can't actually see what's on your visual aid, it's not a visual aid. It's not visual because they can't see it. And it's not an aid because it's not helping you, right? So if you have a physical presentation aid, you either need to have it close enough, which this is kind of awkward, or you need to make it big enough that you can hold it up and they will be able to see it. So think about that in the composition of your visual aids. Also, what's up, you guys? I'm in Miami, and I'm going to go see Vizcaya Museum and Gardens this weekend and go to Biscayne National Park for the 4th discussion forum thread in Persuasive Speaking. I think it's the 4th. Anyways, at some point in the discussion forum for our class, I will ask you to tell me the hidden nugget in this lecture. My hidden nugget for this lecture is a question for you. What is your favorite vacation that you have ever taken? Because I'm sort of on vacation now. I'm still working, but I'm out of town and it's nice and I'm enjoying the warm weather. Had to get out of the cold for a week. So tell me about the favorite vacation that you have ever taken. Where did you go? What'd you do? Why did you love it? That's your Easter egg for this lecture video. Okay. You can also use an electronic presentation aid. You can use a slideshow like PowerPoint, which is what I'm using right now. You can use Prezi, Google Slides, whatever your preferred thing is. You can show a video clip. So if you just wanted to show 30 seconds of something, I would recommend no more than 1 minute of video for a speech of 6 to 8 minutes total. Or you can have an audio clip if it makes sense for your speech, and what type of visual aid you use will totally depend on what's available to you. And we had some time at the beginning of the semester to work out a little bit of the technology when it comes to using a digital visual aid. So hopefully you already have that figured out and you know what type of visual aid is available to you, and you can start thinking about how you're going to use a visual aid in your speech. So when you are making your visual aid, you want to make it clear, first of all, visually clear. So if you're using something digital, it should have a high enough resolution. It's not grainy or pixelated. Or if you're using video or audio, that there's not too much noise that we can't hear it. You want it to be uncluttered. So if there's something on your visual aid that's not serving a purpose, get rid of it. It should be topical. So it should be directly related to your speech, and it should be deployed when it is related to what you're talking about. So if only one part of my speech were about Vizcaya and the rest of my speech was about Biscayne National Park and Everglades National Park, I would not hold this up the whole time. So use your aid only when it is relevant. And then keep it simple. Less is more when it comes to a visual aid. You do not want to distract your audience from you, the speaker. You are still the main attraction. And keep in mind, your visual aid needs to serve a specific purpose. It should enhance the persuasiveness of your speech. And if you need help with that, I am happy to help you. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a presentation that was given in one of my public speaking classes a few years ago by a friend and graphic designer about how to build a better visual aid. And I'm going to just click through this sort of swiftly so you can see a comparison of what a better visual aid might look like. So when thinking about first impressions for a slideshow, this example is about a slideshow, and you might not be using a slideshow, but there are some principles here that will be useful for you. And so we're comparing on top a sort of standard PowerPoint slide, and then on the bottom, something that Brandon created to be more persuasive, more effective. So if you are giving a speech about electronic cigarettes, set the tone, use an image. Remember that a slide with a bunch of words on it isn't really a visual aid, it is a verbal aid. It has words on it. For it to be visual, it needs to have things other than words. So try to maximize your visual space by using things other than words that we will see. If there's a point during your presentation when you don't need your slides to show anymore, put a black slide there. So if you're at a point where you're telling us about your personal story, then you don't need a slide that says my story. What you need is for everybody to look at you and pay attention to you, because there's nothing that the slide is adding to that point. So just make it a black slide, and then everyone will look at you again. Think about ways that you can use imagery to show instead of tell what you're talking about. If you want to define what an e-cigarette is, you don't need to put the definition on the slide. You're going to say what the definition is, and you're still in charge. You're still a speaker, right? And so you want your audience to listen to you. So make your slides more image heavy to help your audience visualize something that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. All those words, you can say those out loud. The image you can't say out loud, and that's where their visual aid is helping you. Okay. So you want to avoid putting multiple points or multiple parts of text onto a slide. So if you look at the top example, we have these three different types of, or three different parts of an e-cigarette. There's a lot of text. And it's going to be too much for your audience to read, and it's not really adding that much for your audience. But by using words and images together, you can actually add more information to your audience. So just by saying a cartomizer or atomizer assembly includes a refillable tank and replacement parts, and you can rebuild the individual components. Well, if I just said that, if you've never seen one before, like that part of it, you might not actually be able to visualize that. And then there's kind of no point in me telling you. But if I can show you a picture of it, maybe you'll realize you've seen something like that before. Or if you haven't, now you know what it looks like, right? So think about how you can use the images to help your audience visualize what you're saying. You want to think about the different types of visual representations for different types of data. So some kinds of data are easier visualized than others. If you are showing years in a history, give us an actual physical, like a picture of a timeline, because that's a type of imagery that we understand goes along with dates, and it helps us to think about the passage of time. We can see how close together or far apart the little dots are on the line, and that shows us sort of the passage of time. If you want to use a chart, a bar chart of some type, think about how you can make it look visually consistent with the rest of your visual aid, so that you're not just embedding a chart from Excel and it doesn't match the rest of your slide, but that it looks like it belongs. Otherwise, all that extra formatting is going to distract from what you're actually trying to show, which is just this trend. Then we're going to be wondering, like, what do the different colors mean? What do those extra numbers on top mean? It's just a lot of things to think about. If you are showing anecdotal evidence, there are lots of different ways you could do that, but you can see at the bottom in this example, this slide is still essentially all text, but by adding the little, people figures, we're adding a layer of information that this comes from people. These are people's opinions. This comes from qualitative data, from, surveys, from whatever. So even though the slide at the bottom is still pretty text heavy, it's adding an additional layer of information through the visual. If you want to show big numbers, make it big on your slide. If you look at the top slide, that 95% lower risk is at the bottom, is small, it's smaller text, it doesn't stand out to you. But if you really want to emphasize these large numbers, make them large on your slide and give them lots of visual attention. If you're trying to sort of compare numbers or show percentages, remember that numbers without context are very hard for people to understand or to make meaning of, or to process easily in the span of a 6 to 8 minute speech. So think about all the different ways that you can layer your data together, that you can create visual representations of all of these different numbers. So if you have like 25 incidents of explosion and fire, 9 injuries, 2 serious, no deaths, 1,500, 3,900, this is a lot, right? So maybe you visualize those big numbers, like how many, like the 1,500, and I don't know, you make them into smaller representative samples. Or if you want to talk about the 25 incidents of explosion, you put 25 little explosion marks, and then you put big red X's for the people who actually got injured, right? So you're finding different ways to actually visualize this data. Data visualization is really hard. There are whole degrees in data visualization. And so you can find resources online to help you with some of this stuff. Again, if you have huge or tiny proportions, so this is the second part of that. The last slide showed the 25 incidents of explosion. That's what these 25 little explosions are on the bottom. In the next slide, we're visualizing how many children are exposed to e-cigarettes. And so if you want to show what that means, you can, make a dot for every 100 children. That's what's going on down here at the bottom. And then you show that out of all of those, only, 0.15% or 1 dot. So there are different ways of showing this data that help us to visualize what that actually means. If you have subset data, or depending on the type of data that you have, there might be other kinds of visual relationships that work. So for example, if you want to talk about how many states have legalized something, show us a map, show us which states. Think about the different, unique types of data visualization that you can do depending on the type of data that you're showing us. And then finish the way you started. This is my recommendation for intros and conclusions to speeches anyway. If you finish the way you started, it gives your speech a sense of finality. So if you open with a joke, end with a joke. If you open with a story, end with a story. If you open with a picture of smoke blowing out of an e-cigarette, end similarly, because it will help your audience to feel like the speech is over. Here are some resources for presentation aids. If you want to use a digital visual aid, Google Slides. PictoChart is a cool infographic website it has a lot of free templates for making infographics. Prezi is another slideshow presentation. You can find cool templates like the one that you see here, this like blue grid background, online as well, if you don't like the sort of standard Microsoft PowerPoint templates. You can find images to use in your speeches as well. If you want a cool image of someone blowing smoke out of an e-cigarette, go online and see what you can find. I use Unsplash a lot. I used to use it in a marketing job, and there are a ton of great royalty-free images that you can use. There are image editors available online if you need to crop unnecessary parts out of an image. We don't have Adobe Creative Cloud at RCC, but this presentation was originally given at UNC. If you want to make an infographic, here are some options for making an infographic. And here are the credits for this presentation, which is a good reminder that every visual aid needs to have citation. And so if you have a slideshow presentation like this one, you might include a small credit underneath an image wherever it appears in the presentation. And then at the end, you would want to have some sort of list of your sources so that we know where you got all of your information from for your slideshow. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to put your whole works cited for the speech itself, but especially for any visual things that we might want to know. Okay. So that's it for persuasive speaking. I have covered all of this as quickly as I could while trying to be intelligible. All of this is also covered in your textbook reading, which should be your primary source for everything. And I will create another video about verbal style and you will have general discussion forums that will help you work through a lot of what we have covered in this lecture and what we will cover in the next one. If you have any questions or concerns about persuasive speaking that are not covered by our textbook, by this lecture, by the assignment instructions or the syllabus, please feel free to reach out to me via email. And I look forward to seeing all of your speech topics this week.